Welcome everyone. I'm Mary Kostakidis, chairing tonight's Vote for Humanity webinar to consider how we may have an impact in the upcoming federal election and why Palestine is the moral issue of our times. Many of us want to ensure that we have more people in Parliament who are not out of touch with their humanity and are committed to international law and to justice for the Palestinian people. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of our land and pay my respects to their elders past and present. We recognise their enduring connection to the land and acknowledge the injustices committed against their forebears. Centuries later, there is a very different sensibility towards the crimes committed against Indigenous people, and different societal norms prevail, reflected in international laws that have come into force following the Holocaust perpetrated against the Jewish people. These norms and laws have been transgressed by Israel in the first ever live-streamed genocide, to the horror of citizens throughout the world, equally appalled at the international community's failure to stop it. Tonight we'll hear from three speakers, all of whom are contributors to public policy website Pearls and Irritations, which is sponsoring this webinar. Margaret Reynolds, Peter Slezak and Stuart Rees. There's a powerful short video, a Q&A for the last 15 minutes of the hour, and we'll be launching an ebook of a great number of excellent articles on what has been the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from the Holy Land for over 100 years. They are important perspectives absent from the mainstream media, voices silenced but for the coverage of independent publishers. And I'd like to acknowledge the contribution of publisher John Menadue over many years, and in particular for a body of work which goes well beyond the contents of the ebook, addressing the injustices perpetrated against the Palestinians. I'll now hand over to our first speaker, Margaret Reynolds, to talk about Australians for Humanity and to launch the ebook. Margaret was the Labor Party Senator for 16 years, a Hawke government minister, an academic in the field of human rights and international relations. She's a member of many civil society organisations and has been a long-time peace activist. Margaret has written countless letters and emails to politicians about how important it is that they take appropriate action on the genocide of the Palestinian people. Margaret.
Thank you, Mary. What is Australians for Humanity? Well, we are actually a group of like-minded people who are quite devastated at the failure of our government and our parliament to respond as they should under the Genocide Convention to the quite horrific atrocities that have been perpetrated against the Palestinian people. We have a small group of us have worked consistently over the last 6 weeks and more to distribute information about the genocide and to talk with many, many people around the country to insist that when people come to vote this Saturday, they consider just who they are going to support, who will stop the genocide. We've consistently said that people should be voting for Palestine, voting for humanity, and voting for international law. Now, I've talked about the small group that has been actively working together to promote this debate and to plan this webinar. But in actual fact, Australians for Humanity is a national movement. There are many, many, many thousands of Australians who are part of Australians for Humanity, and they've been demonstrating this by their actions in our community around the country, certainly in the last 18 months. They've been marching in the streets, they've been contacting their parliamentarians. They've been writing motions of concern to the government, and they have been extremely active. So I think that Australians for Humanity is both large and small. It's the small group that is responsible for tonight's webinar, but in actual fact, it is indeed a national movement. And it's a national movement that will continue beyond the Saturday's election, regardless of the outcome. And we can't predict the outcome, unfortunately, because there are so many Australians who expect our government, our parliament, to stand up for injustice and certainly to stand up and speak out against genocide. Now, I'd like to also comment briefly on why it is important that we ask voters to hold unprincipled politicians to account, because we rely on our representatives. It's our democracy that we choose people to speak up for us. And sadly, there have only been a few in the Parliament in the last 12 months and more who've had the courage to speak the truth about the war crimes and ethnic cleansing in Gaza. So we want those parliamentarians to be recognised, and we want others who've been silent or who've used other forms of language to avoid spelling out exactly what is happening in Gaza. We want them to know that we have been watching, we have been listening, and we've been shocked in many cases by their silence and their failure to act. I now have the pleasure of launching the ebook, Israel-Palestine Pushed Beyond Endurance, Creating Balance. As Mary said, this is a special publication that is the result of the work of Pearls and Irritations, that wonderful initiative that was launched by John and Susie Menadue many years ago now. The ebook is a selection from many hundreds of articles written about the history and daily reality of the Palestinian people. It's a publication that presents the truth, free from the apologies and distortions so often presented by the mainstream media, if indeed the mainstream media bothers to really deal with this terrible issue. It presents an Australian voice from people of diverse backgrounds and faiths. Again, this ebook is going to be absolutely central to an ongoing campaign that Australians for Humanity must continue, because when the election is over, when a new government is formed, when the parliament resumes, there will be a need for all Australians who care for Palestine, who care for humanity, who care for Australia's reputation in the international community. Of all countries, Australia should be speaking out. And that's why this ebook is so very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you for launching the ebook. There's a link to the ebook on the homepage of Pearls and Irritations. It's free, so do download it and recommend it to your networks. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing to have put together. Now, we're going to go to a video, a 7-minute video, and there are 3 speakers in this video with very powerful messages. An Australian Palestinian playwright, scholar and poet, Samar Sabawi. Ayman Quader, an Australian from Gaza. Now, many members of Ayman's family were killed by Israeli airstrikes, and they lay buried under rubble, a consequence of taking shelter in what had been deemed a safe house. And Kathy Peters, a Green staffer in policy development. She's a freelance journalist and has long been a human rights and environmental activist. She's also of Jewish background.
Should you care about what is going on in Palestine? Some of you might think that it has nothing to do with you, that it's something happening really, really far away. But what happens when your favorite musician loses their concert because they dedicated their music to the reporters, the journalists that were killed in Gaza? When many, many reporters are forced to either quit or are being fired for simply reporting the truth of what is happening in Palestine, in Gaza. Do you think that's okay? Do you think this is the kind of country you want to live in? Do you think it's okay that while people in Gaza during the ceasefire have had to go and try to salvage pieces of their loved ones from beneath tons of rubble that would take more than 20 years to clear, while this is happening, our focus here in Australia was to discuss if the protests were causing social lack of cohesion? Is this the kind of country you want to live in, where this is happening and it's okay? It's okay that we accuse the protests of promoting hatred, but we're not saying that actually a genocide against an entire people is wrong. So yes, this is, I would say that this is the moral issue of our time. Just think of what is at stake for you. Your freedom to criticize, your freedom to protest, your freedom to speak out when you see something is wrong. That is what is at stake. And so when I'm voting in this election, I'm going to be voting for someone who is going to be protecting these freedoms and not supporting a state that has been proven by the highest international court in the land of committing crimes against humanity and of carrying out a genocide. And I hope you do the same.
In the forthcoming Australian federal election, I will vote against genocide. I will do so not only by remembering the plight, suffering, and the brutalization of the Palestinian people, especially those who have been killed in masses in Gaza, but also with the lives of fellow Australians in mind. Death and destruction in Gaza is a violation of the Australian values, which supposedly represents acts of love and care for others, values to which I'm committed. Israel killed my loving sister and her 3 children. At least 15 of my immediate and extended cousins have been killed by Israel. Safety is such a great blessing, yet we took it for granted. Back to the candidates standing for this election. Any ignoring of atrocities in Israel's genocide would imply acceptance of the complicity in the brutalities of Israel's war. Israel's live-stream slaughter, starvation, and destruction of Palestinians' life, funded and covered up by the mainstream media and political commentary, has triggered one of the largest surges in the progressive activism in generations, a development that cannot be ignored. Politicians must prioritize the rule of law, uphold the UN and the international court's decisions, and ensure that no state be allowed to abuse the human rights, as in occupying and stealing others' land. If Australian candidates for election wish to show respect for the rule of law, they should guarantee to respect decisions of the International Court of Justice, as in ruling to end Israel's illegal occupation of Palestine. Those candidates should also be asked whether they will abide by the UN resolutions concerning recognition of Palestinian sovereignty.
I'm overwhelmed by the horror that Israel and Western nations unleashed on Palestinians. And I know that we failed to stop Israel, as we have since 1948. We failed to stop this genocide, which Palestinians live-streamed. They believed that the world could not but act with this daily evidence of Israel's horrendous war crimes. For us, where were we? Where were our red lines? Where were the red lines for our government? How is it that Australian weapons technology supplying the F-35 bombers or parts for the tanks that rolled over wounded and dying Palestinians, how is it that all of this continued to flow to Israel? And how could we sign off on a $900 million agreement with Israel's largest weapons manufacturer, Elbit Systems? We did this while the UN, the International Court of Justice, and the International Criminal Court issued one after another ruling, calling on and condemning Israel's actions and calling on states like Australia to take every possible action to stop the genocide. Australia failed to take the action that was required. We failed to take the action that would have had some impact on this atrocity. We didn't apply sanctions. We didn't stop arms exports or arms agreements. We didn't expel the Israeli ambassador or recall our ambassador. We didn't stop dual citizens travelling to kill with the IDF. And we didn't support Palestinians desperately trying to flee the carnage, but rather we made it virtually impossible for many to get visas. At one point, we actually cancelled visas for some as they were in transit. As an Australian with Jewish heritage, I am ashamed to have been an ineffective witness. I underestimated the Labor and Coalition parties' complete lack of humanity and their contemptuous selective use of international law. I'm appalled that the relentless Zionist-led dehumanisation of Palestinians is such that these very same politicians and our compliant media repeated lie after lie after lie, justifying the inconceivable carpet bombing of civilians and the destruction of homes, hospitals, universities, schools, mosques, and everything needed for the survival and for the maintenance of culture and life in Gaza. You know, words will never express the horror and the anger I feel at Australia's complicity. I stand up and applaud the Greens and the few independents for their steadfast position who supported justice and rights for Palestinians, and I will vote accordingly. Labor, however, and the Coalition will never ever be able to rid themselves of the evidence and of the disgrace of their complicity. You and I, we can never again be made to be onlookers to genocide.
That's Kathy Peters. And a correction, Kathy was a Green staffer. She's now a freelance producer and one of a great number of Australia's Jewish community who abhor what Israel is doing. I'd now like to go to Peter Slezak, who is the son of Holocaust survivors and has been an advocate for Palestine for many years. He'll be speaking to you about why this issue is of such great importance to him and why he'll be voting with Palestine and how you might do so too. Peter is an honorary associate professor of philosophy, currently, among other things, co-authoring a book about Noam Chomsky. He's been to Gaza numerous times. His recent visit to Gaza and the West Bank with Lee Rhiannon was the subject of two documentaries, Palestine Under Siege and Palestinians Don't Need Sidewalks. He's a frequent and passionate speaker at pro-Palestinian rallies, and in the weeks after October 7 was abused and assaulted on the streets of Sydney's Double Bay. Peter.
Thank you, Mary, and thanks to everybody. It's a privilege, and in fact, for the reasons Mary mentioned, it's a responsibility that I feel particularly to join with you today. The idea of Australians for Humanity is a noble, if seemingly abstract concept. After all, who could be against humanity? So I want to be more blunt and more prescriptive. Of course, the appeal to humanity is in response, as the others have been saying, to immense barbarity that has been permitted and enabled by us. For more than a year of genocidal horror, everyone can see on their phones how 2 million people in Gaza are being tortured, raped, burned alive, eaten by feral dogs, and now in the final stages of being starved to death. My mother, who survived the Nazi concentration camp at Auschwitz, she always asked why the world didn't do anything to stop it. Well, now we know the answer. We see, as people have been saying, how this has persisted for so long and there's been nothing to prevent it. This means that we all, and of course especially Jews, are facing one of the greatest moral tests of our time. In other words, we must address the practical question of what is to be done. And by the way, you'll undoubtedly recognize that that's the title of a pamphlet written by a certain Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov in 1901, who was better known as Lenin. And I mention that because he argued for true revolutionary change to overcome Tsarist repression at the time and overthrowing capitalism. Well, that's perhaps a bit ambitious for us just now, but I wanted to mention that Lenin highlights the role of a certain revolutionary newspaper called Iskra, perhaps just like John Menadew's Pearls and Irritations, which is a tool for political education and coordination. If you don't read the Australian Jewish News and J-Wire and other Jewish media here and overseas, you can't know that, as in Israel itself, they're wallowing in the tragedy of October the 7th, 2023, and completely ignoring the genocide in Gaza. This is an extraordinary feature of the problem that we're facing in the Jewish community generally. Just now, for example, after meeting with senior Republicans and particularly Trump's Mar-a-Lago with Trump, the Israeli minister Itamar Ben-Gvir said, quote, "They expressed support for my very clear position on how to act in Gaza and that the food and aid depots should be bombed." That's the Israeli minister. Genocide actually is openly recommended by commentators on Israeli television. They're having serious debates on Israeli TV as to whether newborn babies in Gaza are innocent or whether they should be killed. The Israeli journalist Gideon Levy writes, "It was only to be expected," he says, "the discourse has taken on neo-Nazi attributes." He adds that Likud lawmaker Moshe Sada proclaimed on Channel 14 TV in Israel he was interested in starving an entire nation. He says, "Yes, I'll starve Gazans. This is our obligation." This is the kind of attitude that we're facing, not just in Israel, but very widely in the Jewish community. This is very awkward and uncomfortable to talk about, but we have to face it. In fact, the Jewish philosopher Hannah Arendt, who wrote about the trial of Adolf Eichmann, she coined the phrase "the banality of evil" to describe just this kind of attitude. In her other book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, she said, and I quote, "The death of human empathy is one of the earliest and most telling signs of a culture about to fall into barbarism." And in that context, it's impossible to avoid asking the question Noam Chomsky asked, the troubling question during the Vietnam War. He said, and I quote, "These and 1,000 other examples testify to a moral degeneration on such a scale that talk about the normal channels of political action and protest become meaningless or hypocritical." And he said, "We have to ask ourselves whether what is needed is dissent or denazification." Those terms are now being used regularly to describe what we're seeing. And of course, he's talking about us. So our appeal to humanity, to empathy, it has to be understood as an urgent call to action. And according to the slogan on our poster, we have to hold politicians accountable. But what does this mean? In one of my speeches in Hyde Park, I explained somewhat whimsically that I'm learning Arabic, and although I don't know how to say "too little, too late, elbow," I uttered an obscene Arabic curse which rhymes with Albanese, and I won't repeat it here. But the point I want to make is that the wild, enthusiastic applause from the audience tells you what they think about holding politicians accountable. The Labor government has been silent for over a year of unspeakable horror, and worse than silent, as has been mentioned, the government has been exposed by David Shoebridge for direct complicity, a complicity that they have attempted to deny or to obfuscate. Export permits have been granted for inherently lethal goods and technologies designed or adapted for military use. It hasn't received a lot of media attention, but I remind you that the Prime Minister Albanese and Foreign Minister Wong have actually been referred to the International Criminal Court, the ICC, as accessories to the genocide in Gaza under Article 15 of the Rome Statute. Now, by contrast, again, being practical about the election, we could notice which politicians have appeared regularly on the podium at the rallies for over a year now. Look at which party gets all the ticks on our flyer for the Australians for Humanity. So we may recall and adapt a slogan from many years ago. I suggest that it's perhaps too late, as the slogan went, to keep the bastards honest. Rather, we should vote the bastards out. In other words, vote Green or some other independent to create a hung parliament. My view is that in that case, we might have a better chance for compliance with the recent ruling of the ICJ and pressing for an immediate, unconditional and permanent end to the Israeli occupation and the assault on Gaza. Well, that's all I have to say about the concrete, practical issues about what is to be done in this election, but I've got a few minutes left, I hope. And I'd like to talk about some other issues that are close to my heart and I think very important. A training program for New York City Police, the NYPD, is relevant and interesting for us because it categorized the keffiyeh, the Palestinian scarf, and the watermelon, as well as phrases such as settler colonialism, as anti-Semitic symbols. And regarding the Palestinian solidarity movement as a significant threat to Jewish safety. This has been a huge issue here in Australia. There's been a hysteria about this question, which has been, almost entirely unwarranted in my view. One of the groups that led the NYPD training has as its main goal to have elected officials in the US adopt the notorious IHRA definition of anti-Semitism into state law. This has had enormous traction here in Australia as well. The IHRA definition falsely equates criticism of Israeli government policies with anti-Semitism. So among a list of things to be done, we must confront this weaponization of anti-Semitism, which is a worldwide tsunami that has swamped the movement for justice for Palestine. The reasons for this tidal wave of propaganda is that Israel's intense, absurd efforts to deny its vast crimes is obviously not working. As we've mentioned, everyone can see the truth on our mobile phones. Gaza looks like Hiroshima after the atom bomb in 1945. Given this devastation and the sheer quantity of bombing on Gaza, again, I quote Chomsky. Chomsky remarked on the Vietnam War, and he said as follows. He says, with no further information than this, a person who has not lost his senses must realize the war is an overwhelming atrocity. That's the situation we're facing. But the consequence of this is Israel and its flunkies in the Zionist lobby have had to turn to their traditional methods, which are intended to be a distraction, a diversion from the horrors of the genocide which we all see. Of course, we're being inundated with moral panic about an alleged explosion of anti-Semitism and concerned about Jewish safety since October 7th, 2023. In the US, there are draconian measures that, as the Trump administration takes this up and has now punitive movements against many of the universities that it considers too lenient in combating anti-Semitism. Again, mostly fictional, because at the universities, at the encampments, for example, there are always a very significant presence of Jews, as has been here in Australia, at the rallies and at the encampments here in Australia. And of course, the political scientist John Mersheimer puts it very clearly. He says, the idea that there is rampant anti-Semitism in the United States is not a serious argument. It's a protest against genocide. And that's the relevant point, of course, here too. Years ago, to emphasize this point, the Israeli parliamentarian, the late Shulamit Aloni, she said it quite clearly in an interview on Democracy Now! She says, anti-Semitism, yes, it's a trick, we always use it. But this trick is becoming really very, very actively pursued. And the point is obvious. If Israelis and its Zionist supporters were all Buddhists, we'd have the same justified outrage about ethnic supremacism and its sordid history of violent expulsion, expropriation, and ethnic cleansing. However, the IHRA definition explicitly declares it's anti-Semitic to say Israel is a racist endeavor. Just quickly, I'll mention some of the facts that are relevant to that claim. In 2018, Israel passed a nation-state law, according to which Israel is the state of the Jews alone. Human rights organizations, HRW, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, and Israel's own B'Tselem have recent reports showing that Israel is an ethno-supremacist apartheid regime. This is not in the mainstream. The Israeli NGO Adallah, based in Haifa, lists over 50 laws that discriminate against the citizens of Israel who are Palestinians. And now in the US, as we've been seeing, students and activists are being abducted by government agents for saying these things that are defined as anti-Semitism. Governments and organizations around the world, including Australia's 39 public universities, have now adopted a version of this pernicious IHRA definition, which is strenuously promoted by the Israel lobby groups such as ECAJ, Executive Council of Australian Jewry. The definition has been harshly criticized by leading figures such as barrister Jeffrey Robertson, and it's actually been repudiated by its original author because it's been weaponized to silence criticism of Israel. I should mention, perhaps, my own article on the IHRA definition on ABC's online religion and ethics program, the publication online. It's significant when I detailed these facts, the editor judiciously deleted my sentence in which I said that 6 of the accompanying 11 illustrations of the IHRA definition, they concern criticism of Israel. That was carefully dropped from the publication. Of course, we shouldn't need a specific definition of anti-Semitism. It's important to say that some universities have rightly not adopted it because a general a prohibition or action against racism should be. But the point is that political reality now is that it's actually futile to insist on this point in the hope that it will stem the tide. And it's for this reason I want to mention that about 200 Jewish experts on the Holocaust and anti-Semitism have proposed an alternative Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism. It makes no mention of Israel. If you have to have a definition, which I don't think you should have one, but now it seems unavoidable to satisfy this moral posturing, this virtue signaling that the people seem to insist on, okay, use a definition which doesn't mention Israel. So I'm suggesting that the moral panic has not abated and we need to think about this alternative. Well, an important point I want to make is that we must listen to Palestinians who are suffering the consequences of these developments. They're expected to put aside their suffering, their trauma and their grief and to pander to Jewish discomfort about a slogan or a poster. For example, the cricket commentator Peter Lalo was sacked because Jews said they were triggered by the sound of his voice, for goodness sake. And we're supposed to worry about the feelings of those who are unsafe at the universities, for example, by seeing the Palestinian kafir. Now, the young writer Mohammed El-Kurd put it very eloquently. He said, I've got several quotes of wonderful Palestinians who have said this, but Mohammed El-Kurd puts it so well. He says to the Israelis, he says, your warplanes have burnt Palestinian people alive in their tents while they're connected to IV drips on makeshift hospital beds, and I'm asked to care about your stupid feelings. That sums up, I think, appropriately the moral issue. Well, recently, as Mary mentioned, I think, I've received a great deal of abuse for saying publicly that I think Jews should feel uncomfortable, and it's in fact our duty to make them uncomfortable. I don't just mean Zionist Jews. It's difficult to explain this, but I'll try quickly to explain why I think this implicates all Jews, regardless of their own particular feelings about it. The question that I'm addressing is whether I'm encouraging anti-Semitism, as I've been accused of doing. Well, whether they like it or not, all Jews are unavoidably placed in an invidious position by the fact that Israel claims to be acting on behalf of all Jews everywhere. And of course, the leading Jewish organizations, such as the Jewish Board of Deputies, Executive Council of Australian Jewry, Australia-Israel Jewish Affairs Council, and the Zionist Federation of Australia, they are enthusiastic propagandists and apologists for Israel's crimes, its genocide. So in this context, in fact, my remarks express the remarks that have caused such outrage. They're only more explicitly saying what Jews actually around the world have been saying a little bit more obliquely when they say, not in my name. What does that mean? They also say silence is complicity. Well, that's the same sentiment expressed by Archbishop Desmond Tutu famously. He says, if you're neutral in situations of injustice, you've chosen the side of the oppressor. That's what I've been saying. And finally, my remark about the need to make Jews uncomfortable is just the sentiment expressed by the famous New York rabbi, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who marched with Martin Luther King famously. He said, in a decent society that's not indifferent to suffering, a few are guilty, but all are responsible.
Indeed.
Let me wind up quickly by one very important point that I want to still make. I'll be very brief. It's important to say something about the chant that we always use at the rallies around the world. In fact, the slogan, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. This is always condemned as anti-Semitic and calling for the annihilation of Israel. But you have to just listen to the Palestinians. I've got about 5 or 6, but I won't read them all. Palestinians who have been prominent and explicit in what they mean. Rashida Tlaib in America. But here, my colleague, Dr. Lana Tatu, I won't read her wonderful remarks about the idea that we should live. The liberation means the equality for all the inhabitants of the land. I'll just quote the Palestinians, such as the president of APAN, Nasser Mashni. He put it very eloquently in a comment. He says, if you've got a problem with freedom and justice for everyone, the problem is not the chant, it's you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. Our final speaker is Emeritus Professor Stuart Rees, a strong advocate for the Palestinian people for decades. He's been to Gaza many times, has witnessed the humiliation and dehumanization of Palestinians with whom he developed relationships. He's sponsored Palestinian students to come to Australia to study at the University of Sydney Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies and mentored them here. Stuart has always been a force to be reckoned with, and as founder, chair and director at various times of the Sydney Peace Foundation, succeeded against all odds in getting Hanan Ashrawi here to speak and receive the Sydney Peace Prize. And he also had the foresight to propose a Sydney Peace Medal for Julian Assange immediately after WikiLeaks' first major releases in 2010. He's been unequivocal about the moral question of our time. Stuart.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary. Am I off mute?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Look, I'm going to try and be brief and speak to three issues. First of all, something about the history of Palestine. Secondly, a concern about the avalanche of human rights legislation that followed the Second World War that's too easily ignored. And finally, some comments about the nature of humanity. Let me come to the first issue, which is about the history of Palestine. I'm appalled that leading politicians and representatives of the mainstream media hardly ever mention that history. They are so fixated on what happened on October the 7th, 2023, that you'd think all of history started only 18 months ago. They completely ignore the slaughter over decades of tens of thousands of Palestinian men, women, and children. They completely ignore the decades of death and destruction on the people of Palestine and their infrastructure. They completely ignore the Israeli terrorist gangs, and the terrorist gangs include the so-called most moral army in the world, the IDF, wreaking havoc upon the people of Palestine and their land. That history is ignored. Neither the politicians nor the mainstream media are ever brave enough or wise enough to concede anything about that history. Let me come to the second issue, which is about what I've called the avalanche of human rights legislation post Second World War. It's that legislation which gives most of us around the globe a sense of freedom, a sense of liberty, a sense of human rights, a sense of coherence and predictability about our lives. But once again, almost all those pieces of legislation are studiously ignored. The 30 clauses of the Universal Declaration, the Genocide Convention, the Refugee Convention, the Rome Statute that created the International Criminal Court, the rules and predictions and recommendations of the International Court of Justice about genocide, about the pleading for an end to the siege of Gaza, for an end to the occupation immediately, and pressure on the states which signed up to the human rights justice to comply with the rules that were established then. So please, let's remember the history. Let's have sufficient courage and vision to remember that human rights legislation and stick with it. The leading Australian politicians and the media studiously ignore that, so that, in Peter's words, the genocide in Gaza has been able to proceed as though it is of little consequence, as though the main issue in this election, repeatedly made by the media and the politicians, is about the cost of living. It's as though the cost of pork chops in Coles or Woolworths is 1,000 times more important than the cost of not living, than the cost of the slaughter in Gaza and on the West Bank. Let me finish, as I usually do, with a reliance on poets. I want to have a vision about a future Australia. The doesn't depend on cheaper petrol only. I want to have a vision that I want people and myself and my family and my friends, all of whom are appearing tonight, to have a sense of poetry in their lives. The wonderful English human rights poet Shelley said that poets were the unacknowledged legislators of the world. By that he meant that they had a vision about the notion of humanity that was not easily available to people who wrote only in prose. I'm sorry about your prose. I'm not making reference to your prose, of course, Peter, tonight. And his contemporary, the romantic Wordsworth, wrote a long poem about humanity as a protest against war. He was almost foreshadowing the slaughter in Gaza. What a fair world were ours to verse to paint, if power could live at ease with self-restraint, he said. Then he went on to say that all creatures and all living things by degree are friends and patrons of humanity. And if you think that poem is too ancient, let's go to something more recent. A wonderful statement about humanity by the Australian Aboriginal poet Udru Nunukul. I'm for humankind, not colour jibes. I'm international, never mind tribes. I'm international, never mind place. I'm for humanity, all one race. And if the audience still thinks that was 70 years ago, how is it related to the contemporary events? Let's go quickly to the last hashtag apparently made by Pope Francis. Be human, be inclusive, is what he said. And I'll finish because an important use of power for middle-aged and elderly academics is to not talk for too long. That's a non-abusive use of power. But I've always been impressed by a wonderful French diplomat, human rights activist who was one of the architects of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Stefan Hessel. And when he was 91, he wrote a bestseller called Be Outraged. And he was thinking about Palestine. He and his wife had been many times to visit and to be with the people of Palestine. It's important to note that he was Jewish, but he was a man of a great philosophy, of great poetry, of great vision. And he tried to remind all of us that if you are not outraged by injustice, you lose touch with your own humanity. That's really almost the last quote I'm going to rely on and use. I want to finish by an expression of gratitude to AFOPA, the Australian Friends of Palestine in South Australia, who've been talking about Australians for humanity, a sense of justice, a sense of respect for universal human rights for decades. And I also want to express gratitude, of course, to our wonderful mentor, inspiring leader, John Menadue, for his creation of one of the most important and optimistic journals in this country, namely Pearls and Irritations. In talking about gratitude, that's in peace negotiations, in the struggle for justice, in trying to find the kind of social cement that puts people's lives together after they've been ripped apart. Those expressions of gratitude are incredibly important. My last expression of gratitude is to all the people who've registered tonight, and I think in respect to them, we should now proceed to their questions.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Stuart. Thank you. Okay, well, I have several terrific questions. The first one is, why not demand that Hamas hand over all the hostages and end the war immediately? Now, I'm going to leave it open to the panel, so whoever would like to respond, please do, and anyone else can dive in as well.
Yeah, look, I've having been on the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip half a dozen times, and having actually been one of the few Westerners to spend time speaking to the leaders of Hamas, let me say, of course, Hamas should release the hostages, and as long as Israel releases the thousands of hostages who've been held in prisons for decades, and many of them only there by administrative detention, never charged with anything. So if you want a sense of balance, although that's a pretty obscene word in the Middle East, there ain't no balance. You have to talk about a quid pro quo in negotiations, and the release of the Palestinian prisoners, not just a handful, but tens of thousands of them, would be a good rationale for obliging Hamas to release the hostages.
Mary, can I add a quick comment on that?
Go ahead.
The question's a cheeky, provocative question. Fact-checking, Hamas has offered to release all the hostages. They've offered to end the whole thing, and Israel has refused to take up that offer. Do some fact-checking by that person whoever asked the question about the status of that question, and you'll see that it's been Hamas that's been willing to end this, and it's Israel has deliberately not wanted to settle with Hamas on those terms.
Yes, indeed. In fact, a couple of days ago, latest reports were that Hamas was willing to hand over all the hostages.
Absolutely.
And that Israel has not accepted. Anyone else like to comment about that? Or shall I move on to the next question? I think we might do that. So the next couple of questions really are about the media. Because there's been a sense in the community, or in much of the community, that the media is failing us on this issue. One question is, does the panel think that a mass campaign of complaints to ABC Chair Kim Williams, the ABC Ombudsman, and to Media Watch might create a critical mass of outrage that could itself become a media story about the lack of coverage the national broadcaster has given to clear evidence of IDF war crimes and genocide in Palestine? So that question's specifically targeting the ABC, I suppose, because we're funding it. So we're all funding it. Is there, who'd like to comment about that?
I'm
That
happy.
particular question. Yes, Margaret.
Yes, as a former national president of Friends of the ABC, I think that's a wonderful idea. The ABC can be very responsible and independent in some of its reporting, and I certainly would like to mention John Lyons, the journalist who has indeed, done more than any other ABC journalist to bring us at least some of the truth. But yes, the ABC has let us down badly. SBS has been marginally better on occasions, but not on others. So I do think that we have an obligation to complain to the ABC and SBS and to the government about the way the mainstream media just ignores so much reporting. And even if they try to report, they're so ill-informed that they get it wrong from the word go. But great idea. Go ahead. I'll join you.
Anyone else like to comment?
I just wonder if face-to-face conversations with key journalists, not just with the Kim Williams and the senior management in different media outlets, wouldn't be helpful, Mary. And in a sense, you're the best person to answer that question, because my experience with them is that they frequently don't know about the sort of issues that Margaret and Peter and myself have been talking about, and they either don't know, or the Zionist lobby is so powerful that they can't afford to appear to know.
I think it's their business. It's their job to find out if they don't know, and I think the culture is set at the top, really. So I think the suggestion in that question is excellent. One of the functions of media is to inform the public and to hold the powerful to account. One of the areas where that's failed is the decisions by the International Court of Justice, the orders of the International Court of Justice. So by not holding our politicians to account with respect to the responsibilities Australia has as a signatory to international laws and conventions, it means that the public also are not informed about this these laws and conventions that we have signed up to and what Australia's obligations are, and to put politicians in the difficult position of having to explain why we're not acting as we should be. The next question is also about the media. That's right. It's how can we achieve a more balanced Western media about Palestine, a more balanced Western media? Would someone like to tackle that before I have a go?
Well, look, in a way, I would want to treble the number of people who read Pearls and Irritations. That would be a start. I think we have to demystify, people of my age, what is meant by social media posts, because we're told that people of a certain age group never read any newspapers, don't watch or listen to the news, but derive most of what they think is going on from social media posts. So that one needs to demystify. Last comment, really, Mary, about the discussion that goes on in places called universities, and so that the freedom to read and think and debate and criticize on the campuses of Australian universities is crucial to the media, because many of journalists have grown out of university-based newspapers, and yet at the moment there's this absurd fear by cowardly vice chancellors to suppress that freedom of speech.
Let me add something to that, if I can, Mary.
Yes.
We're all fans of Chomsky, so you forgive me for quoting him again. He's written a lot about the universities, and I think Stuart is being a little bit optimistic. His view is that they're actually institutions for generating conformity and obedience, and it's a myth that they're places.
Not when I was there.
No,
no, Stuart.
That's
I
true.
think when all of us were there, we had this illusion that they were centers of free thought and independent critical thinking. I think, again, I've been impressed with Chomsky's evidence of this. It's an illusion that we all enjoy about ourselves, but that's relevant also to the earlier question from Mary about the media, which he's written a lot about. The reality, I think, is that the social media have become a much more important source of, depending on how you choose what you watch, because there's a lot of rubbish on there. But I think the ABC is no longer relevant, and for good reason. Even, surprisingly, if you watch American corporate television, CNN, MSNBC, they're doing long-form interviews, with people that are never asked onto the ABC. You know, Rashid Khalidi from Columbia University, any number that I can think of people who are expressing dissident views of the current situation, and for whatever reason, the ABC can't find them. And this is a very interesting reflection on our public broadcaster, the independent broadcaster, where even commercial broadcasters in the US are running long interviews. Even Piers Morgan, these awful ideologues, are actually giving a lot of time to people that deserve to be heard, that they disagree with. That's not happening here.
No.
Yeah, I agree. Social media is a bit of a misnomer, really. I see it as civic media because of the way I engage with it. People use it for all sorts of reasons, to post photographs of the meal that they're having. But it's also the place where news breaks, without a doubt. It breaks there first. It's the place where we hear perspectives and from experts, whether they're academics or journalists or experts of all different kinds, who are banned now, black banned in the mainstream media. People of enormous stature like Jeffrey Sachs, like John Mearsheimer, academics like Glenn Deason, journalists like Glenn Greenwald, Chris Lynn Hedges, people, who've serious journalists. They are now operating in the social media space with their own websites, with their own podcasts. But going back to the question, I think we do have to complain about coverage. Complain. With respect to the ABC and SBS, they're funded by taxpayers. So they really are obliged to listen to your point of view about their coverage. With respect to the newspapers, write letters to the editor, could just keep persisting. And ultimately, what hurts is when it hits the hip pocket. So advertisers won't advertise if they're not selling newspapers and have digital subscriptions. So cancel subscriptions, fund independent journalism. You know, we get our news from a variety of amazing websites. And in Australia, we've got Pearls and Irritations, Declassified Australia, Michael West, Consortium News operates largely in Australia also, and a great number of other sites that are not based in Australia. So why aren't we funding? Why aren't we contributing to those, to journalism produced there? Some of the best independent journalists that have broken stories on on Palestine on October 7 have been from independent news sites. And I've been attacked by the Herald and the Age because I've quoted their work. So, you know, it's about putting your money where your mouth is, really. If we're going to rely on their work, we've got to also, I think, support them. Would anyone else like to make a comment before I wrap up? Because we're running out of time, and there is some information that I'd like to give people.
But Mary, just briefly, look,
Yes.
I think it's not just pressure, but their response that they've got to find the people who run the establishment, whether it's the leading politicians or leading members of the media or leading members of churches who've been terribly silent about the carnage in Gaza. They've got to find a touch of courage in public life. They've been preoccupied with being cowards, running for cover, trying to avoid the so-called Zionist lobby, or what might be said critically on Sky News, for God's sake. Am I allowed to say that?
You'd have to say anything, Stuart. Okay, look, we've turned through the hours, so it's time to wrap up. Now, in this forum, it's not possible to identify every candidate in every electorate who's going to push for Australia to do the right thing and to do so with the urgency that's required. There's also the matter of priorities beyond Palestine, which may influence how each and every one of us will order candidates or parties. There's a wide choice from the Greens to Fatima Payman's Australia's Voice, the Citizens Party, the Socialist Alliance, and many independent candidates. Some, like Rex Patrick, will appeal to those of us supporting greater protection for whistleblowers, but they may have no position on Palestine. The website that does offer excellent information on where candidates stand on Palestine, and importantly, how to vote cards for every electorate, is Muslim Votes Matter. And I tested it this afternoon and it works. And I just want to show you the page that you need to go to. I hope everyone can see that. That's what it looks like. And you click on Get Your How to Vote card. You enter your postcode, and they've done all the homework. Both Muslim Votes Matter and APAN have developed scorecards for every candidate standing in this election. And the Muslim Votes Matter how to vote card is based on those scorecards. So if Palestine is the moral issue of our times for you, then they have done the homework. All of us at Australians for Humanity will extend to John Menadue our deep-felt thanks for his support in general. If you aren't a subscriber to Pearls and Irritations, better fix that. No matter who your representative in Parliament is after next weekend, send them the ebook. Tell all your friends and family about the many wonderful independent news and analysis sites they could be reading, watching and supporting, including Consortium News, Michael West, Declassified Australia, Independent Australia, Sydney Criminal Lawyers. And thank you very much for joining us tonight.